We are talking about pure democracy. Voting is absolutely an essential. Well, hello, everyone, on this wonderful Saturday afternoon. Even though it's not Saturday afternoon for me, I'm recording this in the wee hours of, is it Wednesday night, Thursday night? I am losing track in the world of KHNC in Weld County, Colorado. So what are we going to be discussing today on the Pink Flame of Liberty? But before we get to that, remember you can always contact me with questions or comments at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. Or of course, you could always just show up on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. I would love to see your comments and I would love to have your support. I had all kinds of other topics planned, which if we have time, maybe I will cover some of them. The tyranny, like who would have thought Canada would have turned into the frickin' tyrants? I mean, I guess maybe you could imagine it, but still, it's Canada. It's Canada. They're like so polite to think that, you know, they're turning into Maoist China almost is just absolutely insane. You know, Justin Trudeau has such a baby face, and it turns out he's the devil inside. I just don't get it. But I found something else that I wanted to cover instead, because I had done multiple shows, and I've said multiple times that I think we are entering the next phase of human political evolution. And democracy was a wonderful invention as compared to what came before at the time it came about, and it's been around for a long time, but it's the God that has failed to quote and probably cause some reeing across the libertarian universe, Hans Hermann Hoppe. Democracy, time is over, and I've been saying that multiple times, and we need to enter into not the age of Aquarius, but the age of the individual. But there was an article somebody had linked to on Facebook, and I'd taken a look at it. It's older. This was before Trump was elected, and it's a very progressively slanted article, a very, very butthurt, progressively slanted article entitled, put on my glasses here, Why Elections Are Bad for Democracy. Funny title. But anything that kind of like rags on democracy, I'm going to be a fan of a little bit. This thing, it's basically just upset that things aren't going their way, and that's why they think elections are bad for democracy, because the progressive agenda isn't being advanced, and the article wouldn't have been written if it was. But even considering that this is basically just a screed because they're not getting their way, and it's written from the perspective of the whole Brexit thing. There's still some good points in here, but the just really butthurtedness of it really did amuse me. So just understand what perspective it's coming from. We're going to go through a lot of it, and I'm going to pull out some points for discussion. But before we do that, I would like to advocate for one of the causes I believe in, which is alternative voting methods. And one of the sponsors of this show is approval voting. Approval voting would move us beyond two-party thinking. There are fewer spoilers. Voters can vote both for a candidate that they really like, who they think has no chance of winning, and also a more popular candidate who has a chance of winning. In case you don't know what it is, you have a ballot with however many names on it, and you put a check mark next to any candidate that you approve of. The candidate that gets the most votes, usually with a majority required, then wins the election. It will lead to more civility. When a group of friends wants to stay friends and are trying to decide on a restaurant or movie, they use a show of hands, which is basically a form of approval voting. It should lead to less polarization because the voter is not forced to focus on only two candidates, and the candidates know that the voter can choose more than one. So they're not going to automatically demonize and alienate people they don't think they might be the first choice of. So again, approval voting would move us beyond two-party thinking. You can contact Colorado's approval voting effort by phone or text at 720-439-6000 or search for the Approval Voting Party. All righty, let's get on with this article now. And again, the context is Brexit. So it says Brexit is a turning point in the history of Western democracy. So I love this sentence because this sets the tone for everything, that you can tell there's just a political agenda here. Never before has the fate of a country, of an entire continent, in fact, been changed by the single swing of such a blunt axe wielded by a disenchanted and poorly informed citizens. Poorly informed? How so, dear sir? Because they disagreed with you? Because, if only, nobody that's informed could ever disagree with me. The chutzpah on this article just it's really a wonder to behold. And it's from The Guardian, by the way. So it says this is a worrying blow to the health of democracy, because you had a bunch of people who must have been poorly informed because they didn't agree with me. But of course, that's basically a conclusion that democracy almost forces you into, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all, and there isn't a majority-fits-all. There's always somebody who is not going to like the decision. And if we are talking about peaceful decisions that don't force other people into things against their rights, why shouldn't everyone win? That's what libertarianism advocates, that everyone gets to win, not just the majority. So it says, a survey found in the past 10 years that there has been a considerable increase. I guess that is an incredible increase as well, and calls for a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. You want to know what? I say the same thing. And you want to know who that strong leader is? You. No one can run your life better than you. And it's funny, we used to have that as a banner on many of the Libertarian Party's Facebook cover pages. But when you looked at it fast, just the font used made it look like nobody can ruin your life better than you. And I suppose that's true as well. But don't you have the right to ruin your own life if you want to? You can run it and ruin it. You don't need anyone else to do that for you. And it says that trust in governments and political parties has reached a historical low. It would appear that people like the idea of democracy but loathe the reality. Isn't that true? It's kind of like communism, isn't it? People think they like the idea of communism, but they wouldn't like the reality. And now I'm not making an equivocation between the two. I certainly would much rather live in a democracy than communism. But that's not, just because I would, rather get punched in the face than shot in the head doesn't mean getting punched in the face is a good thing. So it says everywhere in the West, political parties, the key players in our democracies, are among the least trusted institutions in society because in general, power corrupts. We've seen that even in the Libertarian Party. I've been telling you and exposing corruption within the LP. You constantly have to shine the light of day. You constantly have to hold leaders accountable. The temptation for even just to grab the ring of power, to become Gollum, even when there's no real power, is almost irresistible. Who should have the power in your life? You should have the power in your life. It says there's something explosive about an era in which interest in politics grows while faith in politics declines. It is explosive, and I hope it's explosive to a peaceful revolution of voluntary action, of people becoming their own bosses, their own rulers. We can all win. That's not the conclusion this article is going to come to. This article actually has an interesting concept that I hadn't known about before I read this article. So there is some value, there is some education here to learn. It says, what does it mean for the stability of a country if more and more people warily keep track of the activities of an authority that they increasingly distrust? It's a good thing that they're warily keeping track of it, because then they will realize how corrupt and broken it is. This author just seems to long for the days where people wouldn't be wary or wouldn't keep track. Anybody in leadership in your life, particularly political leadership. Watch them like a hawk. When I was still on the LNC, of course I still consider myself on the LNC, which is the Libertarian National Committee. I do not accept their fraudulent removal for being a whistleblower. I even said then, watch us like a hawk. And it continues, how much derision can a system endure? Hopefully not too much more. I've always said, you want to know what kind of revolution it would take to bring down the oppressive state? Not a revolution of guns, not a revolution of violence, a revolution of laughter. If everyone just together pointed and laughed, we would see that the emperor truly has no clothes and is completely vacuous. So how much derision can a system endure, especially now that everyone can share their deeply felt opinions online? How dare the peasants? It says there's just passion and distrust. And I see that as a sign of hope. It says, but it is still a heresy to ask whether elections in their current form are a badly outmoded technology for converting the collective will of the people into governments and policies. I would take that one step further. It is heresy to say there should even be a collective will. It's not the mode that is outdated, it is the entire concept of the social contract, of the collective will that is outmoded and just immoral at this point in our development. You should run your life. Do you have thoughts and feels about this discussion? Shoot them to me at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. All right, we'll talk about this more after the break. And welcome back. So we're continuing on with this progressive screed that nevertheless has some good points, why elections are bad for democracy. Again, it is cast in the context back in June 29th, 2016, in the context of Brexit. So it says, we discuss and debate the outcome of a referendum without discussing its principles. Says who? Because they're not your principles? I watched with a lot of interest what was going on and cheered on Brexit. But of course, I'm probably the type of ignorant person that this article writer is railing against, despite the fact that I was a national officer in a political party, very politically engaged, but not the right kind. Not the right kind. It says, we ask people directly what they think when they have not been obliged to think. Well, in some cases, that is in fact true. Again, I'm not here to defend a democracy. Although they've certainly been bombarded by every conceivable form of manipulation, though, of course, this article isn't manipulation. Of course, anything that would have led to not having Brexit wouldn't have been manipulation. Oh, boy. It says this system of delegation to an elective representative may have been necessary in the past, when communication was slow and information was limited, but it's completely out of touch with the way citizens interact with each other today. This conclusion doesn't come from the premise. In fact, I think when communication is not slow and information is not limited, it probably works better, at least for better in quotes, for actual representation. Because back then, when communication was slow, and, this type of interaction was limited, you really wouldn't be able to watch your representative like a hawk. You wouldn't be able to give them instant feedback, which of course has its pluses and its negatives, but I think the pluses far outweigh the negatives. It said even in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had already observed that elections alone were no guarantee of liberty. Of course not. Yeah, there's very few things. What's it? Only eternal vigilance is the guarantee of liberty. It says the people of England deceive themselves when they fancy they are free. I know that's a terrible accent. They are so, in fact, only during the election of members of parliament. For as soon as a new one is elected, they are again in chains and are nothing. And I would say not even during the election. Because some person's choices will be outvoted by others. And why? If they are peaceful people. And if they're not peaceful people, the issue of the election isn't the issue anyway. It's the unpeacefulness that is the issue. We should be self-governed. It says, referendums and elections are both arcane instruments of public deliberation. I would say the arcane instrument is public deliberation itself, unless it is voluntarily and consistently, constantly entered into. To say it was voluntarily entered into when the Revolutionary War happened, or whatever point in time you want to point to, I cannot be bound by the decisions of my ancestors. I cannot even be bound forever by the decisions of myself a year ago. My will is not alienable unless you commit aggression. And your will isn't alienable, but your freedom can be curtailed. It says, if we refuse to update our democratic technology, we may find the system is beyond repair. It's not the issue, isn't the technology, as they put it. The issue is the system is beyond repair, no matter what we do. It says 2016 already risks becoming the worst year for democracy since 1933. Why? Because you're not getting your way? Now, I'm not saying 2016 was great. I was not a Trump fan. I wasn't a fan of a lot of things that were going on. But I'm like coming at this from, I hated both sides, y'all, at least in this country, the two sides. This person, I believe, who's writing this is in Belgium. So, a little bit of a different political situation, but same humans, same human rights and human needs. It says, we may find, even after the folly of Brexit, that Donald Trump wins the American presidency later this year. But this may have less to do with Trump himself or the oddities of the American political system than with a dangerous road that all Western democracies have taken, reducing democracy to voting. Basically, reducing democracy to democracy. Because what he wants to advocate later is primitive democracy, maybe a form of democracy, kind of like even our republic. We're not a pure democracy here either. Thank the Lord that we're not. So it says, isn't it bizarre that voting, our highest civic duty? I reject the idea that this is our highest civic duty. Our highest civic duty is not to commit aggression against others. This can be the lowest civic duty very often when you are voting for aggression against others, when you are voting to send government agents to steal the property and money of others, where you never have to get your precious little hands dirty. You just pull the little knob and people die over there. And I'm the one to confront you with it. You need to realize what you are doing when you do that. It says, is this really the place where we turn individual gut feelings? Well, dare you have an individual gut feeling into shared priorities. I don't need you to share my priorities other than a respect for rights and that you don't commit aggression against me. Other than that, think what you want. Be free. Is this really where the common good? I don't believe in the common good. I believe in the individual good and the non-aggression against other people. There's no common good. Not the sacrificing of the individual and you call it good. I call it evil. And the long term are best served. So again, he goes into some things about how Belgium became the laughingstock of Europe a few years earlier when it failed to form a government for 541 days. I say congratulations. That was 541 days of maybe, getting the right idea. It says, but many Western democracies are in the process of turning Belgium from your pen to God's ears, brother. It says democratic fatigue syndrome. Is not caused so much by the people, the politicians, or the parties. It is caused by the procedure. No, it is caused by the very institution itself. It is inevitable. Democracy is not the problem. Yes, it is. Voting is the problem. You mean not getting your way? You mean when this common good that other people feel just doesn't agree with you? That's the problem. I'm translating for you here. My word. It says, where do citizens get the chance to obtain the best possible information, engage with each other, and decide collectively on their future? Well, you don't get to decide on my future by right. You may have forced your way into doing it now. When I say you, it's the collective you, not necessarily this person from Belgium. Did I say from Belgium? It's like Canada. From Belgium. You don't get to decide collectively on anyone's future. You get to decide on your own. Why are you so frightened of that? Or why do you have such desire to control other people? It says the words, and then he goes on to say about how, and I'm assuming it's a he. Was it written by a he? Yes, David Van Raybroek. I might be mispronouncing that. How even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that voting is a basic human right. No, it isn't. It says, isn't it remarkable that this declaration contains such a precise definition of how the will of the people? There is no will of the people. There is only individual wills. Groups do not have greater rights or even characteristics than any of its individual members possess. It says it is as if the people who compiled that declaration back in 1948 had come to see the specific method as a basic right, as if the procedure itself was sacred. The procedure itself, if you are a fan of democracy, is the highest expression of democracy. I don't care whether you like it. I want you to face it and realize it's democracy itself that's the problem. We need autocracy, self-rule, autarky. And he's saying people who actually believe in voting as the highest expression of democracy, which it is, are electoral fundamentalists. These types of terminologies just make me chuckle. It's like climate denialists or science denialists. You do not bow to the Fauci. Electoral fundamentalism is an unshakable belief in the idea that democracy is inconceivable without elections. Well, it kind of is. And elections are a necessary and fundamental precondition when speaking of democracy, because they are. Electoral fundamentalists refuse to regard elections as a means of taking part in democracy. No, I think they do see it that way. You're just creating a straw man. Seeing them instead as an end in themselves. I don't know of anyone, even the most ardent believer in the will of the people, who sees the election as an end in and of itself. They all do see it as a means. You are creating such a straw man here, dear sir. Oh boy, and we are going to continue. We insist that in every country in the world, people must traipse off. Traipse is a word that's not used nearly enough. Off to the polling stations. Our electoral fundamentalism really does take the form of a new global evangelism. Elections are the sacraments of that new faith, a ritual regarded as a vital necessity in which the form is more important than the content. You almost had it right. You almost had it right. This idea of the collective will, this idea of the state, that is in fact the new religion. And yes, this is a ritual in that religion, but it is a vital necessity in the ritual of that religion, if you're going to call the religion democracy. Okay, let's continue this discussion, because as he's criticizing democracy while still yet wanting to preserve democracy, he's going to move to an entirely different form. Now, it might be a different form. It might be a little democracy mixed with something else, but it is not pure democracy that he's going to advocate. We are talking about pure democracy. Voting is absolutely an essential component of it if we are talking about pure democracy. Now, if you want to argue against pure democracy, go ahead, but don't pretend like you're defending democracy by saying we need a little less democracy and have democracy with a little of this. Okay, fine, but that's not pure democracy, and I reject the whole kit and caboodle. That's another term that's not used nearly enough. Traipsing off with the kit and caboodle. And while you traipse and we kit and we caboodle, I will talk with you again after the break. Let me take this moment to promote my husband's business. Are you in the market to buy or sell your home? I would hope that you would consider engaging a liberty-loving realtor that I can vouch for on the highest possible terms. My husband, Wayne Harlos, of the Harlos Real Estate Team. In our years sharing a home office together, I have seen the time and care that he takes with each and every one of his clients, no matter the dollar value of the sale. And unfortunately, that's just not something you can always find with a realtor. Many realtors have bigger fish to fry, particularly if you're a young couple or a first-time homeowner or home buyer. And that's just not how Wayne operates. In fact, he takes so much time and consideration sometimes that I feel like, hey, it's your wife over here. But you want to know what? Getting a good and caring realtor is one of the most important decisions you can make. So please do consider giving Wayne a call at 303-229-3435 or emailing him at wayne@harlosrealestate.com. We both truly appreciate it. Now, here's where he's going to reach back into history. He says elections originated in a completely different context from the one in which they function today. When the supporters of the American and French revolutions proposed elections as a way of learning the will of the people, once again, I'm interested in the will of the peaceful individual. There were no political parties, no laws regarding universal franchise, no commercial mass media, and no internet. The forerunners of our representative democracy had no idea that any of these things would come into existence. Yeah, and so such a perfect system should be able to withstand such things. And it's like he's almost, yearning for the days where, only the right kind of people get to have a say. So he urges, as he calls it, urgent reconsideration of the nature of our democratic fuel, because if we don't, a systemic crisis awaits. From your pen to God's ears. It says if we obstinately hold on to a notion of democracy that reduces its meaning to voting in elections and referendums at a time of economic malaise, we will undermine the democratic process. So in other words, he is channeling George Bush. We have to destroy democracy to save democracy. Let's see what kind of solution he has, because I was fascinated by it, because I learned something new. He said in the years after the Second World War, Western democracies were dominated by large mass parties, and they held the structures of the state in their hands. Like God, they hold the whole world in their hands. Through a network of intermediary organizations such as unions, corporations, and party media, they succeeded in being close to the lives of individual citizens. But you notice what he described? It was like almost this bubble. He basically said, back then, there were echo chambers, and boy, was that nice. This resulted in an extremely stable system, right, an extremely stable, stagnant system with great party loyalty. The party, comrade, the party is all, and predictable voting behavior. It says this changed in the 80s and 90s when discourse was increasingly shaped by the free market. Oh no, we cannot have the free market of ideas. We should be born and die in the same ideology as our parents. It should be very, very predictable and stable. Party newspapers disappeared or were bought up by media concerns. Commercial broadcasters entered the field, and even public broadcasters increasingly adopted market thinking, because market thinking is human thinking, whether you like it or not. Viewing, reading, and listening figures became hugely important. They always were. It's just different today. But people are people. Humans are going to human. They were the daily share price index of public opinion, while gathering around the water trough might have been in the Wild West. Humans are going to talk. They are going to seek each other's opinions. Sure, it is done on a larger scale and faster now than ever before. But the very fundamental principles behind it all is still the same. Commercial mass media emerged as the most important builders of social consensus. Well, too bad for social consensus. An organized civil society lost ground. The consequences were predictable as citizens became consumers and elections hazardous. Elections have always been hazardous. Elections have always been about force. And people have always been consumers, whether you like that or not. Said in 2004, the British sociologist Colin Crouch came up with the term post-democracy. And this is what Mr. Crouch had to say. Under this model, while elections certainly exist and can change governments, public electoral debate is a tightly controlled spectacle. But isn't that what he was saying he was longing for before? It might not have been a spectacle, but it was tightly controlled. You had party media, you had your unions, you had your neighborhoods, and you just didn't deviate. Managed by rival teams of professionals, expert in the techniques of persuasion. Have you ever read any of these old party newspapers or old party propaganda? They were experts in the techniques of persuasion and rhetoric. And considering a small range of issues selected by those teams, same thing then. The mass of citizens plays a passive, quiescent part, responding only to the signals given them. Our monkey brains are going to monkey brain. In other news, water is wet. After the rise of the political parties, the introduction of universal suffrage, the rise and fall of organized civil society. Are you saying, I know he's not, but I'm just laughing because usually universal suffrage is the rallying cry of the left. You get the women to vote, you get the minorities to vote, you get the non-landowners to vote. And if there's going to be elections, if that's the system we're going to have, yes, you must absolutely have universal suffrage. But it's so funny how that's now become the boogeyman. And the dominance of commercial media, another factor has been added, social media. There's always been social media. It just hasn't always been electronic. Ask any woman, she'll tell you about the quote-unquote social media of her youth, the gossip little coffee clutches of teenage girls and young women. It says the most popular politicians are those who succeed in altering the script. Go and read the propaganda from around the time of the Civil War if you really want to see rhetoric about altering the script. Go and read the Federalist Papers if you want to see the masters of altering the script. Oh, I'm just stumbling over my words, altering the script, because the Federalists were really the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists were the Federalists. There is nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon once said. In other words, those who can bend the media to their wills. It was slower then, but it was the same principle. He continues, since we have reduced democracy to selecting representatives and reduced representative democracy to simply mean voting, a valuable system is now mired in deep difficulties. Yes, those voters who will not do what you would wish them to do. Winning the next election has become more important than fulfilling the promises made in the last. That is politics. That is democracy. When people figure out they can vote themselves, plunder from other people, that's the beginning of the end. It says, making the best of the system we have is becoming increasingly difficult. Good. Good. We continue. People care deeply about their communities. Very true. And want to be heard. But a much better way to let the people speak than through a referendum is to return to the central principle of Athenian democracy, drafting by lot or sortition, as it is presently called. So this is his solution. Basically, well, he's going to explain it, but it's a subgroup. Either it be by lottery. That sounds, I'm not going to say that sounds good, but that sounds deliciously random to my anarchist heart, but you'll see it's not going to be quite so random as he says. It's going to be the right kind of people. In ancient Athens, the large majority of public functions were assigned by lot. Renaissance states such as Venice and Florence worked on the same basis and experienced centuries of political stability. Well, define political stability, because I think if you go back and you look at some of those times, it wasn't quite so politically stable or good for some people. In a lot of these ancient societies, particularly in ancient Rome, there were more slaves than free people. it's these funny, you're looking in the past and you're cherry picking certain things without realizing that history is all of one piece. It's the butterfly effect. You can't pull out the one thing you like without having the rest. Okay, we're going to continue in our last segment with his argument, and I'll talk to you after the break. Remember, tell me what you think. I do want to hear what you think, even though he might think you're grossly uninformed, at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. So, when democracy was birthed, it was done by lot. Okay, I did not know that. I found this part fascinating. So with sortition, you do not ask everyone to vote on an issue few people really understand. But you draft a random sample of the population, because that's a way to get people who really understand, isn't it? And make sure. How do you make sure? See, the menace underneath here is very interesting. And make sure they come to grips with the subject matter in order to take a sensible decision. Who decides what is sensible? A cross-section of society that is informed can act more coherently than an entire society that is uninformed. You mean informed in the way that you approve of. So it continues, an independent research bureau put together a random group of 66 citizens. Now here's where it gets interesting. Here's where it's not quite as random as he might have led you to believe. Taking account of age, sex, and place of birth. The diversity this produced. Notice there isn't diversity of thought. There's just diversity of like physical characteristics and happenstances of chance, such as where you were born, was helpful when it came to discussing such subjects as same-sex marriage, the rights of women, or the ban on blasphemy in the current Constitution. Why wouldn't you want diversity of thought as well? Because that's the whole thing that is supposed to be sorted out through this sortition. However, they did not do this all alone. Participants listened to experts. We all know how the experts, the experts have told us about COVID, and now all of a sudden the science has changed, and received input from other citizens. More than 1,000 contributions came in on the subject of gay marriage. How is that any different than the thousands of contributions you may get on the subject of gay marriage on social media? Why is this hand-selected person, or you call it random, but it's not, because you're taking into account all of these other factors. Why is that not as good? The decisions made by the convention did not have the force of law. The recommendations first had to be passed by the two chambers of the Irish Parliament, then by the government, then in a referendum. So basically, he's talking about filtering things through this allegedly kind of sort of not really random group of citizens, that those then go through the representatives. He said, what if this procedure had been applied in the UK in the last week? Remember, this is going back to before the 2016 American elections. What if a random sample, it's really not quite so random though, is it, of citizens had a chance to learn from experts? Which experts? You know there are experts who were in favor of Brexit. You know that, don't you, dear sir? Listen to proposals, talk to each other, and engage with politicians. And that's different than today. How? That you get to more tightly control it? Is that how it's different? What if a mixed group, what's the mixture? Do you mean ideologically mixed? Of elected and drafted citizens, oh, that kind of mix, had thought the matter through. What makes you think that the people who disagreed with you didn't think it through? Because if they did, they just couldn't possibly disagree with you? What if the rest of society could have had a chance to follow and contribute to the deliberations? And that's different from the public discourse that goes on now. How? What if the proposal this group would have come up with would have been subjected to public scrutiny? Do you think that what's going on now is all in secret? Do we think a similarly reckless decision would have been made? And there it is. He said the quiet part out loud. See, this handpicked group that we could only expose to certain select experts and certain select opinions and certain kinds of scrutiny and certain kinds of control wouldn't come up with a reckless decision that I disagree with. Now, plenty of times in my own country, in our country, dear listeners, there are decisions we might all think are reckless. Decisions that we don't agree with. But to then turn around and say, well, if only I controlled it. Take that to its next logical step. You can control it. You can control your own situation and your own life and stop seeking to impose your will upon other peaceful people. Again, I'm speaking of libertarianism. I'm speaking of radical libertarianism. But everyone wins in that subject except those who want to control others. But those are not peaceful people. But all peaceful people can win. And that's the solution that I'm seeking for. Is it utopian? Is it pie in the sky? Perhaps. Thinking democracy it can work, though, is much more utopian and impossible as far as I'm concerned. It says the risk of corruption is reduced. Is it really? Is the risk of corruption reduced when you have a smaller target group that you can target for the corruption? Election fever abates and attention to the common good increases. Voting on the basis of gut feeling. What makes you think that the smaller group won't have gut feeling as well? Is replaced by sensible deliberation. Boy, the buzzwords are a buzzin' here. As those who have been drafted are exposed to expert opinion, expert approved, proper opinion, objective information, okay, and public debate. Citizens chosen by lot may not have the expertise of professional politicians. That's a good thing. But they add something vital to the process. Freedom. Can't have the freedom of everybody, though. We can't have that. The word freedom. Boy, I was listening to a show today. It was coming out of what's going on in Canada and how, like, freedom now is just this right-wing buzzword for domestic terrorists. The redefinition of freedom. It's sick. After all, they don't need to be elected or reelected. Then maybe they need to get everything they can get out of it now. Juries for criminal trials that are chosen by lot prove that people generally take their task extremely seriously. You cannot compare, I think, the two subjects. Now, these people probably would take their task very seriously. It doesn't mean it's the right way to control other peaceful people's lives. Criminal trials, people understand the things at stake. You're talking about taking away somebody's property or freedom, and they're accused of something, and you're sitting in judgment of them. Perhaps if people realized more that when you are voting or deciding on the public good, that you are basically holding a gun to your neighbor's head, then maybe they would take it as seriously as a criminal trial. Maybe it would carry the same gravitas. But no, that's not the way we take it. It says the fear of a chamber that behaves recklessly or irresponsibly is unfounded. That's just ipsedixit. They may not. We've seen juries behave recklessly and unfounded. O.J. Simpson trial, anyone? If we agree that 12 people can decide in good faith about the freedom or imprisonment of a fellow citizen, then we can be confident that a number of them can and will serve the interests of the community in a responsible manner. Totally different subjects, particularly when you're going to get something out of it. People in a jury don't get anything out of it. They can isolate and separate themselves from the issue. The people who are voting on who's going to get money and who's going to get privileges and what community's going to get this and that are getting something from it. It says the arguments put forward against sortition are often identical to the reasons once put forward for not allowing peasants or workers or women to vote. But you are the one, in fact, making that argument now, because while you might allow some peasants and some workers and some women, it's only the ones that can be exposed to your proper opinion. You really are wanting to exclude the vast majority of peasants, workers, and women, aren't you? How is that any different than the people who make the argument that only landowners should vote because they are the ones who actually have a concrete material stake in the society, and the ones who will probably be taxed, and the ones who are, the pillars as it was once thought. How is yours any different? It says, do we think Brexit might still have been possible if citizens had been truly invited to express their grievances and search for solutions together with those they had voted for? Brexit was the solution. You just don't like it. Too bad, sugar pie. Oh boy, that was such a work of propaganda. It took multiple pages to say basically nothing in his ultimate thesis. But there was a lot of very interesting background information. I loved learning about the sortition. That was an interesting concept, to go back multiple centuries to try to save a modern system. Shall we go back to the horse and buggy as well? Because, those cars. Why don't we move forward instead of looking back to ancient Athens? Do we not think that there's been progress in human society, in human morality, and in human civilization? Why don't we look forward to the next step rather than looking back to the past? Okay, everyone, I hope you have an awesome week. Remember, you can always get in touch with me by looking at my YouTube channel, Pink Flame of Liberty, or writing me at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. You can ask questions, you can give me comments, and you can also inquire about very, very affordable advertising opportunities. But until we speak again, I hope you have an awesome week. Mi guapas de libertad.
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business, not because they want to